Chapter C.10 of the Anarchist FAQ. Is free market capitalism the best way to reduce poverty? It is far to say that the supporters of free market capitalism make the claim that their system not only benefits everyone, but especially working class people, indeed the very poorest sectors of society. This is the position during the so-called anti-globalism protests of the 21st century, when the issue of global inequity and poverty was forced to the front of politics for a time. In response, the likes of the economists portrayed itself and the big business seeking lower costs and higher profits as the real champions of the poor, particularly in the Third World. In this perspective, growth is the key to reducing absolute poverty rather than, say, redistribution, struggle for reforms by means of direct action, and popular self-organization, or, heaven forbid, social revolution. The logic is simple. Economic growth of 1% per year will double an economy in 70 years, while 3% does so in just over 23 years, and 5% growth takes a mere 15 years. Thus, the standard right-wing argument is that we should promote free market capitalism, as this is a growth machine par excellence. In fact, any form of redistribution or social structure is considered counterproductive in this viewpoint, as it harms overall growth by either scaring away capital for a country or blunts the incentives of the elite to strive to produce more wealth. Over time, wealth will, to coin a term well-worn, trickle down from the wealthy to the many. What to make of this claim? Again, it does not contain an element of truth, as capitalism is a grow or die economy, see section before. Obviously, the amount of wealth available to a society increases for all as the economy expands, so the poor will in general be better off absolutely in any growing economy, at least in economic terms. This was the case under Soviet state capitalism as well. The poorest worker in the 1980s was off far better economically than one in the 1920s. As such, what counts is relative difference between classes and periods within a growth economy. Given the thesis that free market capitalism will benefit the poor especially, we have to ask, is this actually true? And, if so, can the other classes benefit equally well? This means we need to ask whether the assumption to concentrate on absolute poverty or inequality, rather than relative value, makes more sense. Similarly, we need to question the assumption that free market capitalism is the growth machine its supporters assert, and whether the beneficials of the growth it produces do, in fact, trickle down. Questioning these assumptions is essential. The key problem with evaluating such claims is, of course, the fact that an economy, like a society, is a very complex system which evolves through time. There are few opportunities for controlled experiments with which to test different analyses and theories. This means that any attempt at analysis of these claims must be based on looking at different countries and time periods in order to contrast them. Thus, we will look at the same countries at different periods, the more social democratic post-war period to the more neoliberal post-1980s, and more neoliberal countries with those in which free market reforms have not been pushed as far. As we will show, the track record of freer market capitalism has been, at best, distinctly unimpressive, and, at worst, significantly poorer. However, this appeal to reality will not convince many supporters of capitalism. For the true believer in the capital market, this kind of evidence does not create any doubt in their ideas, only the conviction that the experiments did not go far enough. Thus, for the ideologue, freer market capitalism handily tells us nothing about free market capitalism, unless, of course, it can be portrayed as an economic miracle, regardless of the facts. For advocates of the market, the sanctity of private property and private contracts is held as an inalienable natural right. To refute charges that this will simply benefit the already wealthy, they spend much time arguing that unfettered capitalism is also the only economic system which will produce the greatest benefit for the greatest number. In other words, the absolute capitalism markets and private property rights coincides exactly with personal interest. A clearer example of wishful thinking could hardly be asked for. Yet it is not hard to see what function this plays. Few people will be persuaded by their assumptions on work and markets, given the common sense objection that free exchange between the weak and the strong will obviously benefit the latter more. Yet more people may be convinced to go along with free market proposals by considerations of economic efficiency and the hope that the poor will see their living standards improve over time, particularly if experts with economic degrees are involved, as people often assume they know what they're talking about. Now, the empirical track record of what is called capitalism is decidedly mixed. There are three courses of action open to the market advocate. The first is to embrace the property rights argument wholeheartedly and say that we should adopt pure capitalism even if it hurts a large percentage of the population because it is the right thing to do. And this would be unconvincing for most people, as economic austerity and serf-like working conditions in return for protecting the power and property rights of the few who actually own the wealth would find few sane or disinterested supporters. Then it could be argued that the empirical track record of actually existing capitalism should be ignored in favor of economic ideology, as reality is simply not pure enough. That, again, would be unconvincing for obvious reasons that we would be being asked to have faith in the validity of economics. As we have noted before, this would not be wise given its surreal assumptions and non-scientific nature. This would have a one positive-sided effect, as doing this would mean that market advocates would have to stop claiming that all the good things we have are due to something, capitalism, that does not exist. So that option is unlikely to have many supporters or convince many. Finally, it could be argued that contrary to appearances, capitalism does benefit everyone. While this option is not compatible with intellectual honesty, it is by far the most popular within the ranks of market advocates. This is undoubtedly because the wealth and corporations are always willing to pay well for people happy to defend their power and profits against the reality they produce. So, what if the claims that capitalism is the best way to help the poor? That capitalism will especially benefit working class people? To make sense, to be more than simply a rhetorical assertion, it must rest on two basic notions. First, that free market capitalism will have a higher growth rate than alternative forms of that system, such as state capitalism or regulated capitalism. Secondly, that inequality will be less and shares of wages in the national income more in free market than in other systems. This must be the case, otherwise free market reforms do not especially help working class people. We will discuss the first claim here before discussing the track record of neoliberalism in the next section, following a discussion of the history of capitalism and free trade in section C.10.2. We then analyze the failings of the equality defense in section C.10.3, before ending with a discussion on the limitations of looking at income and growth in evaluating how capitalism benefits the working class in section C.10.4. As we show, there is a substantial difference to suggest that the standard preferences of free market capitalism are not up to much. Let us be clear and say that there is generally a positive correlation between economic growth and the income of the poor. We are not attacking economic growth as such, but rather asking whether neoliberalism's own defense actually stands up. Looking at the historical picture, then, yes, capitalism does produce much more economic growth than previous social systems such as slavery and feudalism. However, defending capitalism on the basis that it better than a slave market-based economy is hardly a strong foundation, particularly when capitalists are happy to locate to dictatorships which have slave-like labor conditions. The more substantive argument is based on the assumption that free market capitalism produces faster economic growth than other forms of that system, and that growth of the economic pie is more important than how it is distributed. In other words, the same or even smaller share of a bigger pie in the future is better than the share of the existing pie. This means that we need to look at the economic performance of capitalist economies, comparing the neoliberal ones to regulated social democratic ones. We would expect the former to be performing significantly better than the latter, in addition to being more dynamic after reforms than before. This reality hardly matches the claim. The attempt to compare and contrast economies can be found in, say, the works of Milton Friedman, to show the superiority of his beloved free market capitalism. However, as economist Thomas Malone notes, to prove that socialist policies had crippled Britain's economic growth since 1945, Friedman began by misrepresenting the size of the public sector. He chose a ratio which, though irrelevant, gives spurious support to his thesis. Equally, Friedman compares post-war Britain to post-war Japan and West Germany, conveniently failing to note that both hardly had minimal states. For example, West Germany had approximately the same level of spending as the UK, and Japan had the social planning of its Ministry of Industry and Trade. As below notes, the consequences of socialism are then illustrated by referencing to the weak economic performance of Britain in comparison with Japan and Germany since 1945. This is an odd comparison to choose when judging the impact of socialism on Britain. Surely what we need to compare is the British performance during a period of sustained boom under Friedmanism, in the period 1900 to 13, with the record under socialism, say 1945 to 75. However, to do that would mean noting that the average annual rate of growth per head of gross national product between 1900 and 1913 was a mere 0.2%. compared to 2.2% between 1948 and 1975. Even taking other starting dates, such as the slump year 1893, produces a smaller rate of growth than the post-war period, from the irrelevance of conventional economics. Nor do things get better when we look at the Friedman-influenced Thatcher government, which turned the UK into a poster child for neoliberalism. Here again, the facts do not really support the claims in favor of freer markets. As Ian Gilmore, a moderate conservative member of parliament at the time, points out, during the Thatcher years, growth was lower than in any period of similar length since the war. He notes that the vast discrepancy between the Thatcherites' claim for their policies and what actually happened. Unsurprisingly, there was an unparalleled rise in poverty, as relative poverty grew significantly during the 1980s, from nearly a tenth in 1979 to nearly a fifth in 1987. In 1979, the poorest fifth had just under 10% post-tax income, and the richest fifth had 37%. 10 years later, this had fallen to 7% and risen to 43%. The rich got rich, and the poor got poorer. Not only did the poor not share in the limited growth that took place between 1979 and 1990, the poor were relatively poorer than they had been on 1979. From Dancing with Dogma. We will return to this issue in session C10.3. Things did not get better in the 1990s. Growth in GDP per capita was steadily decreased in the UK from 2.3% per annum between 1950 and 1970 to 2.1% between 1970 and 1979, and to 1.9% between 1979 and 1997. For the US, a similar process was at work, from 2% to 2.3% to 1.5%. At best, it can be said that the growth rates of Germany and France between 1979 and 1997 were worse, at 1.7% and 1.4% respectively. However, before 1979, their growth was much higher, 5.1% to 4.5% between 1950 and 1970, and 2.8 to 3.3% between 1970 and 1979, respectively. Growth in labor productivity per hour worked is hardly impressive, being 2.3% between 1979 and 1997 compared to 0.8% for the US, 2.4% France, and 2.2% for Germany. This is well below the 1950 to 1970 figure of 3%, and only slightly better than 2.1% during the strike found in the 1970s. In 1979, the UK was 9 of 15 European Union members in OECD measures of prosperity. By 1995, it was 11th before rising back to 10th in 1999. In summary, the idea that Britain has a clearly superior economy to the continent is a delusion. By Adair Turner, from Just Capital to Liberal Economy. The best that can be said of Thatcherism is that during the 1980s, Britain put an end to 3 decades of relative decline and caught up some lost ground versus continental leaders. But Britain's absolute productivity and prosperity performance is still below the European average, and its pace of catch-up has been slow. Combine this with longer working hours compared to the rest of Europe, we have a situation in the UK where too many companies relying on low wages and a flexible labor market to remain competitive, rather than on investment in capital, equipment, and technique. Looking at the historical picture, it should be stressed that the UK has been in decline since the 1880s, when it remained the only developed nation to embrace free trade, and that between the 1950s and 1970s, the absolute growth rates per capita compared well with the interwar years and with the period of British leadership in the 19th century. This lack of success for neoliberal reforms can also be seen in New Zealand. The economic results of its liberalization project were just as poor. Between 1984 to 98, per capita income grew only about 5.4% or 0.4% per annum, well below the European Union average, and one of the lowest rates of increase among the OECD countries. And needless to say, because the rich got richer and rebellious workers controlled, both the UK and New Zealand were proclaimed economic miracles. This lack of dynamism is not limited to just the UK or New Zealand. As left-wing economist Andrew Glynn notes, the fact that there was no general improvement in growth in the 1980s could be explained away by the fact that the policies were only picking up steam. The real puzzle is the 15 years since 1990. Why have these free market policies failed to bring an increase in the growth rate? In fact, growth per year has fallen since 1973, with 1990 to 2004 the lowest rate yet for the USA, Europe, and Japan. This applies to other economic indicators as well. The fact that output per head has been growing more slowly since 1990 than it did in the turbulent period 1973 to 9, never mind the golden age, must be a severe disappointment to those who believe that unleashing the free market would restore rapid growth. He summarized evidence by pointing out that economic performance overall has been unspectacular in capitalism unleashed. As Chomsky summarizes, neoliberal-style programs began to take shape in the 1970s, and since then, real wages for the majority have largely stagnated or declined. The relatively weak benefit system has declined as well. Incomes are maintained only by extending working hours well beyond those in similar societies, while inequality has soared, as has personal debt. Moreover, this is a vast change from the preceding quarter century, where economic growth was the highest on record for a protracted period and also egalitarian. Societal indicators which closely tracked economic growth into the mid-1970s then diverged, declining to the level of 1960 by the year 2000 from failed states. The assumption is that producing freer markets and a purer capitalism will result in higher growth and so rising living standards. So far, note two experts, the promises have not been realized. As trade and financial markets have been flung open, incomes have risen not faster but slower. Equality among nations has not improved, with many of the poor nations suffering an absolute decline in incomes. Within nations, inequality seems to have worsened. The trend towards more inequality in the 2 decades after 1980, overall income growth slowed dramatically. For example, rich countries saw annual per capita income growth fall from 4.8% in 1965 to 80 to 1.4% in 1980 to 95. Medium countries saw a fall from 3.8% to 3.1%, excluding China. This was 3.2% to 0.6%, as China rose from 4.1% to 8.6%. For the poor nations, there was a rise from 1.4% to 2%, but this becomes 1.2% to 0.1% when India is excluded. India saw a rise from 1.5% to 3.2%. In fact, income dropped by 0.4% a year between 1980 and 1995 for the least developed countries. It had risen 0.4% a year between 1965 and 1980. In more advanced countries, income growth was lower in the 1990s than in the 1980s. Over the entire post-1980 period, it was substantially below that of the 1960s and 1970s. In America, for example, annual growth of per capita income has dropped from 2.3 between 1960 to 79 to 1.5 between 1979 and 1989, and 1% between 1989 and 1996. Per capita income growth up to 1998 was 1.4% per year, still less than the 1.6% between 1979 and 1980 and 1980s, and about half the growth over the 1960 to 1973 period. Given that income equally improved during the 1960s and 1970s before worsening after 1980s, for most countries, particularly in the USA, this means that even these most increases flowed overwhelmingly to those at the top of the income hierarchy. In America, the working hours for a middle-class family has increased by 10.4% between 1979 and 1997. In other words, working-class people are working more or less. In most advanced nations, there has been not a sizable increase in poverty. The exceptions being the USA and the United Kingdom, where poverty grew respectively by 2.4 and 5.4 percentage points between 1979 and 1991. Jaffe and Larry Mission, Inequality in the Global Economy. The lack of rising growth is a definite feature of neoliberalism. The promise of the free market capitalism has borne no fruit. Growth did not accelerate, it was slowed down. During the 1960s, the average rate of growth of world GDP per capita was 3.5% per annum. The average rate of growth of world GDP per capita was 2.1% per annum in the 1970s, 1.3% per annum during the 1980s and 1% per annum during the 1990s. This growth was more volatile compared with the past, particularly in the developing world. The growth was also unevenly distributed across countries. Economic inequalities have increased in the late 20th century as the income gap between rich and poor countries, between the poor and the world's population, and also between richest countries to GDP per capita and the poorest countries of the world rose from 35 to 1 in 1950 to 42 to 1 in 1970 and 62 to 1 in 1990. The ratio of GDP per capita in the 20 richest countries to GDP per capita in the poorest 20 countries of the world rose from 54 to 1 during 1960 to 62 to 121 during 2000 and 2002. The income gap between people has also widened over time. The ratio of the average gross national product per capita in the richest quintile of the world's population to the poorest quintile of the world's population rose from 13 to 1 in 1965 to 60 to 1 in 1990 and 74 to 1 in 1997. Income distribution within countries also worsened. Between 1975 and 2000, the share of the richest 1% in gross income rose from 8% to 17%. In the US, from 8.8% to 13.3% in Canada, and from 6.1% to 13% in the UK. According to Deepak and Nair in Globalization, History and Development, A Tale of Two Centuries in the Cambridge Journal of Economics. In fact, between 1950 and 1973, there was a vastly superior economic performance compared to what came before and what came after. If laissez-faire capitalism would benefit everyone more than really existing capitalism, the growth rate would be higher during the later period, which more closely approximated laissez-faire. It is not. As such, we should always remember that if anything is proclaimed an economic miracle, it is unlikely to actually be so, at least for the working class. Looking at the American triumphalism of the late 1990s, it was easy to forget that in the 1980s and the early 1990s, despair of the U.S. economy was commonplace. Then people looked to Japan, just as they had looked to Europe in the 1960s. We must also note that there is a standard response by believers on laissez-faire capitalism when inconvenient facts are presented to them, namely to stress that we have not reached the market utopia yet and more reforms are required. A feature of hardline free market analysis is that when liberalization does not work, the reason is always timidity, and the solution is obvious: complete the job. Another possible defense would be to stress that the results would have been worse if the reforms had not been implemented. These are, of course, possibilities, but given the rhetoric used by the defenders of capitalism on the wonders and efficiency of free markets, it seems strange that making them look freer would have such negative effects. And looking at the history of capitalism, it appears that social democratic capitalism with strong unions and a welfare state produces not only more growth, but also more equitable growth, as one expert notes. If the welfare state were abolished and taxes reduced accordingly, society would become a great deal more unequal. John Hill's Inequality of the State. Or, movements to more laissez-faire capitalism has resulted not only in lower growth, but also growth which accumulates in fewer hands, which makes sense considering the basic anarchist insight that a free exchange benefits the stronger of the two parties. As such, based on its own criteria, namely economic growth, then neoliberalism has to be judged a failure. Do not get us wrong. It is possible to still advocate laissez-faire capitalism on ethical grounds, if that is the right word. It is simply doubtful that it will produce the boost in economic growth or employment that its advocates suggest. It may do, of course, as actually existing capitalism, is still far from the pure system of the textbooks, but it is significant that movements towards the ideal have produced less growth, along with greater inequality and relative poverty. This is not to suggest that anarchists support social democratic capitalism rather than more laissez-faire forms. Far from it. We seek to end all forms of that system. However, it is significant that the more equal forms of capitalism based on strong and militant unions produced better results than freer market forms. This suggests that the standard right-wing argument that collective organizing and fighting to keep an increased share of the wealth you produce harms the overall economy and so harmful in the long run are deeply flawed. Instead, it is the lack of any struggle for equality and freedom that is correlated with bad overall economic performance. Of course, society's struggles are pain for the capitalist class. Rather than produce a road to serfdom, social democracy created a full employment environment which reduced their rebellious population. The move towards freer markets was a response to the socialist struggle, an attempt to serf the population, which has proven to be somewhat successful. As such, Kalecki's 1940s prediction, quoted in section B4.4, has been proven correct. The ruling class would prefer social peace, obedience, rather than higher growth, particularly if they get to monopolize most of the gains of that lower growth. Finally, we should note that there is a slight irony to see right-wingers say that pure capitalism would benefit the poor especially. This is because they usually reject the idea that aggregate economic statistics are a meaningful concept or that the government should collate such data. This is a particular feature of the Austrian School of Economics. As such, it would be nearly impossible to determine if living standards had improved any faster than under the current system. Given the history of actually existing capitalism, it is probably wise that many market advocates do so. Moreover, any subjective evaluation, such as asking people, which resulted in a negative response, would be dismissed out of hands as envy. Ironically, for an ideology which says it bases itself on subjective evaluations, economists are always ready to ignore any which conflict with their ideas. Needless to say, even if it could be proven beyond doubt that pure capitalism did not help the poor, but rather enriched the wealthy, then almost all free market capitalisms would not change their ideas. This is because, for them, the outcomes of the market are hallowed, and if they result in increased poverty, then so be it. It just shows that the poor are lazy and not worth high incomes. That they sometimes utilize their rhetoric of social concerns simply shows that most people still have concern and solidarity for their fellows, a concern which capitalism has not managed to totally remove, much to the chagrin of the likes of von Hayek. See Chapter 11 of Alan Hayworth's Anti-Libertarianism for a short but relative discussion.